Today I will be talking about the Tokugawa Shogunate. The tumultuous changes of modern times in Japan unfolded against the backdrop of more than 2 centuries of unprecedented peace and social order. This era was known as the Tokugawa period after the family name of Japan's military rulers and ruled between 1603 to 1868. The Tokugawa administrative system was known as the Bakufu Han. Bakufu means the military administration of the shogun and Han means the zamindari of the daimyos. In the age of the Tokugawa period, these two systems were well combined. The Tokugawa order was bolstered by harsh laws and restrictions of social and geographical mobility. The Tokugawa shogunate were feudal rulers of Japan established by the Tokugawa family. This period is also known as the Edo period and it gets its name from the capital city of Edo, which is at present Tokyo. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled from the Edo castle from 1603 until 1868 and it was abolished during the Meiji Restoration. Following the Sengoku period of warring states, the central government was largely re-established by Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi during the Azuchi Momoyama period. And after the Battle of Shigekihara in 1600, the central authority fell to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who completed the process and he received the title of shogun. The bakufuhan taisei was a feudal system in the Edo period of Japan. Baku or tent is an abbreviation of bakufu meaning the military government, that is the shogunate, and hans were the domains headed by the daimyos. The Tokugawa period brought about 250 years of stability in Japan. In the Bakufuhan, the shogun had the national security and the daimyo had the regional authority. It was a mixture of centralized and decentralized authority. The feudal hierarchy was divided into various classes of daimyos. The Shinpan or the related house, they were very close to the Tokugawa shoguns and they held honorary titles and advisory posts in the Bakufu. The second class was the feudal or the house daimyo and they were rewarded with lands close to the Tokugawa holdings for their faithful services. And the third group was the Tozama daimyo. The Tokugawa shogun not only consolidated their control over the reunified Japan, but they also had unprecedented power over the emperor, the court, the daimyo, and the religious orders. The emperor was held up as the ultimate source of political sanction for the shogun. The shogun had the military power, the emperor had the political and religious power. The shogun had the power to discard, annex, and transform domains. Sankin Kotai was a system of alternative residence in which the daimyos would reside in alternative years between the Han and the attendants in Edo. In their absence from Edo, their family was to stay in Edo as hostages until they return. Despite the establishment of the shogunate, the emperor in Kyoto was still the legitimate ruler of Japan. The administration of Japan was a task given by the imperial court of Kyoto to the Tokugawa family, which they returned to the court after Meiji Restoration. Now I will be talking about the society, about the Tokugawa society. After a long period of inner conflicts, the first goal of the newly established Tokugawa government was to pacify the country. It created a balance of power that remained fairly stable for the next 250 years, influenced by Confucian principles of social order. Most of the samurai lost their direct possession of land. The ownership of land was concentrated in the hands of 300 daimyos. The daimyos had the choice: give up their sword and become peasants, or to move to the city of their feudal lords and become paid retainers. During the Tokugawa period, the social order barred on inheritance position rather than personal merit and was rigid and highly formalized. At the top were the emperor, the court, together with the shoguns and the daimyo. Below this, the population was divided into four classes by a system called mebunsai. The samurai on the top, the peasant at the record level. After the peasants were the craftsmen, and the fourth level was the merchant class. Outside these classes, there were other two classes, the ita and the hinin class. Ita were butchers, tanners, and undertakers. Hinin served as town guards, street cleaners, and executioners. The individual had no legal rights during the Tokugawa period. The family was the smallest legal entity, and the maintenance of the family status was of great importance at all levels of society. In the Edo period, vital commercial sectors developed. In the urban centers, well-educated elite class developed. Sophisticated government bureaucracy also developed. The society was a closely unified nation with highly developed financial and marketing system with a national infrastructure of road. Economic development during the Tokugawa period included urbanization of domestic and foreign commerce and the diffusion of trade and handicraft industry. Trading center flourished along with banking facilities, and merchants associations developed. In the Han, the authorities oversaw the rising agricultural production, and rural handicraft also spread. By the mid-18th century, Edo had a population of more than 1 million. Osaka and Kyoto also had a large population. Many other castle towns also developed. Osaka and Kyoto were busy trading and handicraft producing centers, while Edo was a center for the supply of food and essential urban consumer goods. Rice was the base of economy, as the daimyos collected taxes from the peasant in form of rice. Taxes were high, about 40% of the harvest. Rice was sold in various markets in Edo. It was during the Edo period that Japan developed an advanced forest management policy. Increased demand of timber resources for construction, shipbuilding, and fuel led to deforestation, which resulted in forest fire, floods, and soil erosion. In response to this, in 1666, the government instituted a policy to reduce logging and increase planting of trees. The policy mandated that only shoguns and daimyos were authorized to use woods. By the 18th century, Japan had developed detailed scientific knowledge about silviculture and plantation forestry.
Was the tax rate of 40% uniform for all the social classes, or did the tax go up as the caste hierarchy decreased?
It was more or less uniform for all social classes.
Even the samurai and the daimyo class, even they had to pay taxes of 40%.
Yes, they have to pay taxes, but they were the people collecting taxes. They didn't pay taxes.
Okay, they kept aside a part for themselves and paid it to the emperor.
They gave military services and homage to the shoguns.
So this tax, was it paid in cash or in kind?
Kind, in rice.
In rice. Okay.
And ultimately it went to the emperor or to the shogun.
Shogun, and ultimately the emperor. But because it will go to the shogun, because shogun was the ultimate power in Japan. Emperor was there. Emperor existed.
So the shogun's power superseded the power of the emperor.
More or less. more or less at this time.
So the emperor became more like a puppet ruler.
Yes, he became more like a puppet ruler.
Ma'am, about the land ownership in Japan, who was technically the owner of the land? Was it the emperor, or was it the daimyo and the samurai classes, or the peasants, or was it a multiple ownership?
No, it was the samurai classes. Land was given by the shogun to the samurai classes.
They had the ultimate ownership.
Yes, land was given to the samurai classes by the shoguns. You have to remember that shogun has given the samurai classes the lands.
So he has the ultimate control over the entire.
He has the
land of
ultimate
Japan.
control over the samurai classes at one stage.
So the peasants were basically like slaves, but like
Yes,
serfs.
they were basically like slaves. Because high taxes, they had to pay high taxes in form of rice.
And land was given in exchange of military service.
Yes, and homage. The vassal feudal lords give military service and homage to the shogun.
Like you said, the samurai and the daimyo classes, they were hereditary. And below them, there were many other social classes as well. So were those classes also hereditary, like the caste system of India, or could the people change their classes by changing their occupations?
No, they were also hereditary classes because below the samurai there was the craftsmen, the merchants, and at the lowest level there was the ita and the hinin. So it was an hereditary system that existed,
So can we compare it with the caste system of India?
and to some extent, of course, because ita and the hinin were the lowest in the caste hierarchy.
So the Itas or the Hinas, they could never become a samurai.
No, never.
Never. Even if they could never become a military leader or even a
No.
part of the military.
No. Regarding artistic and intellectual development, it is seen that during the Tokugawa period, Japan progressively studied Western science and techniques, though information and books which they received from the Dutch traders. The main areas that were studied included geography, medicine, natural sciences, astronomy, art of language, and physical sciences such as electrical and mechanical sciences. The flourishing of Neo-Confucianism was a major intellectual development during the Tokugawa period. Confucian studies had been kept active in Japan by the Buddhist clerics, but during the Tokugawa period, Confucianism came out from the Buddhist religious control. This system of thought increased attention to a secular view of man and society. Ethical humanism, rationalism, and historical perspective of Neo-Confucian doctrine appealed to the official classes. By the mid-17th century, Neo-Confucianism was Japan's dominant legal philosophy and contributed directly to the development of the Kokugaku school of thought, that is the national learning. Buddhism and Shinto were both still important in Japan. Buddhism combined with Neo-Confucianism provided the standard of social behavior. Rigid separation of Tokugawa society into Han, ward, household and villages helped to reaffirm local Shinto attachment. Shinto provided spiritual support to the political order and was an important tie between the individual and the community. Shinto also helped to preserve a sense of national identity. The Kokugaku movement emerged from the interaction of these two belief systems. While talking about the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the end of this period is particularly known as the late Tokugawa shogunate. The cause for the end of this period is controversial but is recounted as the forcing of Japan's opening to the Commodore Perry of US Navy, whose armada fired from the Edo Bay. This brought about a complex political struggle in Japan. But the continuous anti-Bakufu movement in the mid-19th century brought about the final downfall. During this period, there were 154 famines, out of which 21 was widespread and serious. Peasant unrest grew, and by the late 18th century, mass protest over taxes and food shortage was a common feature. Drought followed by crop shortage and starvation, which resulted in 20 great famines between 1675 to 1837. Although Japan was able to acquire and refine a wide variety of scientific knowledge, the rapid development of industrialization during the 18th century in the West created for the first time a material gap in terms of technology and armament between Japan and the West, forcing it to abandon its policy of seclusion, and this brought about the final downfall of the Tokugawa Shogunate. By the 19th century, Western intrusion was seen. Russian warships and traders came close to the Kuril Islands. British warship was seen near the Nagasaki harbor. Dutch traders and warship was seen in 1808, and between 1810 to 1820, many other Western traders and Western warship was seen in the Japanese water. Although the Japanese made some minor concessions and allowed some landings, but they largely attempted to keep the foreigners out of their land. The major ideological factor during this period were divided into pro-imperialist and the shogun forces. Although these two groups were visible, there were other groups who were trying to use the chaos of the Bakufu to fulfill their own personal interests. Further, there were two other main driving forces for dissent. First was the resentment of the Tozama daimyos, and secondly the anti-Western sentiments following the entry of the Perry. In this chaotic situation, the Tokugawa Yoshinobu became the head of the Tokugawa Shogunate, and he feared that the daimyos of the Satsuma and the Chosu clans were becoming very, very powerful, and other daimyos were also becoming very powerful. And ultimately, he resigned from his power, and with the Meiji Restoration, the Tokugawa Shogunate ended. So we see that from 1603 to 1868, a major development took place in the first goal of the newly established Tokugawa government was to pacify, brought about some sort of development in the sphere of economy, in the sphere of society, and also in the intellectual development. But ultimately, they could not retain their powers for a long time. At the end, with the Meiji Restoration, the Tokugawa Shogunate came to an end.
So why did the shogun give it up? Like, since he was more powerful than
He
the
was
emperor?
initially he was very powerful, but later on he became very unpopular. His popularity decreased, and people of Japan were, they were very much, they felt insecure under the shogun. And ultimately, with the coming of the Western powers, it hit the Japanese sentiments. And moreover, there was food shortage, peasant unrest, drought, famines in the country. All this precipitated to the downfall of the Tokugawa Shogunate. But the ultimate situation came with the entry of the Western powers. Because by the mid-19th century, there was already an anti-Bakufu movement in Japan. And there were two driving forces in Japan. One was pro-imperialist and one was the shogun forces. But beside this, there were other forces who were trying to trying to use this chaos in the Bakufu to fulfill their own personal interest. But ultimately, there were two forces of dissent. One was the resentment of the Tozama daimyo, and second was the entry of the Western powers and the anti-Western sentiment with the entry of Perry. So this brought about the ultimate downfall of the Tokugawa Shogunate.
But you had mentioned in your lecture once that the Tokugawa Shogunate could give ultimate peace, stability, and economic development.
It was initially when the Tokugawa Shogunate started. It gave peace, social stability, development to the Japanese society. But at the end, we see that there were drought, there were famines, there was shortage of food, and between 1675 to 1837, there were 20 famines in Japan. So all this situation precipitated to the downfall. Though the entry of the Western power may be one of the reasons, but from the mid-19th century, there was an anti-Bakufu movement which existed in the Japanese society, which ultimately brought about the end of the Tokugawa Shogunate. The Tokugawa Shogun had to resign.
Why did the Tokugawa shoguns try to impose restrictions on the geographical mobility of their subjects?
The Tokugawa shoguns bolstered harsh laws and restriction, and they wanted to stop the geographical and also social mobility of the subject, because they thought if these subjects were given independence in all sphere, then the power of these subjects or the power of the feudal lords would be increased, because already they have the military power. These sort of vassals, in lieu of land, they were giving military help to the shoguns. So until their geographical mobility and social mobility is restricted, their power would be increased.
Then the Dutch traders, you talked about the Dutch traders, how they were studying Japanese society, writing on Japan. So, but they came much later, right? Only in the 18th century, late 18th century, and after that.
Early 18th century. Early 19th century, some of them came.
So, were they taking the ocean route through the Indian Ocean, that part, or the land route?
An ocean route. Japan has secluded itself from the Western world, but in the late in 18th and the 19th century, the Western intrusion was seen in Japan, and this hit the Japanese sentiment because they have had an anti-Western feelings. So they did not wanted the Westerners to enter Japan.
Why did this anti-Western feeling develop among the Japanese?
From the beginning, they had this anti-Western feeling that they would not allow the Western traders or Western whalers to enter into Japan. It was a social structure.
Was it an anti-Western feeling in particular, or in general an apathy towards a xenophobia?
A xenophobic feeling.
Xenophobic feeling, like be it Eastern or Western, anyone outside Japan.
No, anyone outside Japan cannot enter Japan.
Yeah, so it was not.
It was a very closed society.
It was a very closed society, and with the rapid industrialization in the West, they could not compete. So there was again a gap in terms of material development in Japan.
That happened during the Meiji Restoration.
With the Meiji Restoration, not with the Meiji Restoration, with the coming of the Komeito period, the Westerners actually started entering Japan. Though from 1810 to 20 we see Westerners coming, but mostly with the coming of the Komeito period, that is the US Navy, the Western intrusion started in Japan.
Ma'am, about the Western powers, you said the traders who are coming in, what were the main trading centers and what did they want to trade in?
Actually, when we were talking about the Western powers, first I'll talk about the trading centers. The main trading centers were Edo, Osaka, Kyoto. These were the main busy trading centers. When the Western powers intruded Japan, they were searching the enemies at that time. They have entered as traders. British warships can be seen in the Nagasaki harbor. Russian whalers and warships can be seen in the Kuril Islands. But at that time, they were just entering and searching for their enemies. Later on, with the Meiji Restoration, the trading activity increased in Japan. Initially, they just entered.
So this period there was not much trade.
There was trade within Japanese society,
Internal
handicraft industry, marketing facility, other small trading centers developing, banking developed during that time, and there was one important thing, the Merchants Association.
Okay.
Merchants Association had developed during this period.
Were any of the developments in Japan inspired by Western developments, or were they completely unaware of what was going on in the West?
No, they were not influenced by Western development. At this period, at Tokugawa period, they were not influenced by the West.
Economy, society, culture, nothing
No.
at all.
They were too isolated.
They
for
were
that.
very isolated. They followed a policy of seclusion. With the coming of the Komeito Perry, they
For the
broke the
first
policy
time-
of seclusion. It was from the Meiji period that economic, social, intellectual development is seen. Industrialization is seen in Japan. And it was influenced by the Western powers.
What was the exact relation of the shoguns with the emperors?
The emperor was the source of all power in Japan. Though the shogunate was formed, but yet it sanctioned everything. It was a system very similar to the Indian context. You know, you have studied about the Chhatrapati and the Peshwa. It was a similar system which existed in Japan during the Tokugawa period, in which the emperor was the political and religious leader, and on the other hand, shogun was the military leader.
So can we say that they were just a part of the bigger empire?
Yes, they were the part of the bigger empire.
They did not enjoy any autonomy.
Yes, of course they enjoyed autonomy. Though the shogunate, though the emperor was there, yet the main powerful man, the main power was in the hands of the shoguns.
So is there no instance that the shoguns went against the emperor and they revolted? Are
No,
there any instances?
Or some sort of a military coup where the shogun tried to take over the power
No,
of
it
the
was not
emperor.
the shogun. Sometimes the samurai did against the shogun, but not the shogun against the emperor.
The samurais were again
Under the shoguns, yes.
And they were just the military, they were the feudal lords.
They were the feudal lords,
feudal lords and
and they were given lands, and in lieu of lands, they gave military service and homage to the shogun.
like the fief in the medieval Europe is
Yes.
a structure. Is it somewhat like that?
Yes.
It was like a dual government.
It was like a dual government because initially the emperor was powerful, but gradually the shogun became very powerful. And the shogun, at last, at the end, the shogun has to resign or give up his power. And his rule ended with Meiji Restoration. And with Meiji Restoration, the power went into the hand of the Meiji Emperor.